Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay down the back. And I hope you can understand my accent. It's a little bit different from yours. But I love the New Jersey accent. It's really good. I really like it. Now, I'm grateful to be here tonight. I'm very proud to be associated with the Tea Party and what you guys are doing, and I'll explain why in the course of the evening. But what I would like to start with, a lot of people ask me why, as a New Zealander, I care about the internal politics of the United States of America. And I'll say there are two basic reasons. And the first one is simple gratitude. Now, my country would not be free, or would have been enslaved, if it had not been for the huge sacrifice of American servicemen during the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea in World War II. You guys saved my country from subjugation by the Japanese, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Thank you. And the second reason is related. It's a little bit more selfish. Basically, Ronald Reagan had it right. America is the last best hope for mankind. If freedom falters in this country, it will fall everywhere. If America loses its military dominance, loses its freedom, the Russians and the Chinese and the Cubans and the Nicaraguans and the Iranians and the North Koreans and all their allies will carve up this planet amongst themselves. In New Zealand, I live at the bottom of the South Pacific. 1,000 miles to the north of us, the Chinese have basically taken over Fiji. They control the place. They're already trying to buy influence in my country. They're already working hard to get my country into their orbit. And I know that the day the US Navy stops patrolling the South Pacific is the day that my country becomes a Chinese vassal state. Okay? And I do not want that to happen for my sake or my kids' sake. So I have a very, very strong vested interest in your country, restoring your republic, keeping your defences up, and looking after your allies, Israel, New Zealand, and the other allies and friends that you have around the world. So I care about what happens. I care about what happens here. I can assure you of that. Because you guys are on the front line now. Freedom stands or falls in what happens in America. So tonight I want to discuss what I call the central secret of communism. You'll see where this is going to lead. So the real secret of communism is not atom bomb spies or labour union agitators or rioters in the streets. It is the ability of a tiny Marxist-Leninist party to get their policies adopted as the law of the land in their own countries. That means that in France they can get their policies pushed through the French Parliament and adopted as the law of the land. The same in Australia, the same in New Zealand. In America it means getting it through the Democratic Party, getting onto the floor of the United States Congress, through the Senate, and signed off by the President. And they have done this many, many times. Now you might think this sounds a little bit far-fetched, so I'd like to give you some examples. In 1984, in my country, we elected a Labour government, a socialist Labour government. And one of the very first things they did was to enact legislation banning nuclear warships from our harbours. Now that was sold to us as that destroyed the Australia, New Zealand, United States military alliance, because your warships could no longer come to our ports. Now that was sold to us not as an anti-American thing so much, but as a patriotic stand, that we were standing up against the nuclear arms race. We were striking up for peace, you know, we were striking an independent course. And it is so ingrained in the New Zealand psyche today that even our conservative, pro-American governments don't dare touch it. It's part of our culture now. And it's not And so I would like to explain how that happened. Now 1984 was the time of the massive anti-nuclear marches throughout Europe. It was the time when Reagan was campaigning for Star Wars and he was working to oppose communism in Latin America. It was a crucial time in the Cold War and the big battle between East and West. So, at that time, a little after that, I interviewed a New Zealander who infiltrated the New Zealand Communist Party for our security intelligence services, the equivalent of your FBI. In 1983, he was selected by the communists to go to Moscow for training at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning on Leningradsky Prospect in Moscow. There were 7,000 students there, some on 7-year courses, many on one-to-one tutelage. There were South Africans and Danes and Sri Lankans and Indians and Koreans, Australians, Canadians, Mexicans, Irishmen, Swedes. Virtually every country on the planet was represented except for one, the United States of America. And why was that? Because at some point your government had told the Soviets that had any Americans been caught training there in Moscow, there would be war. And they respected that. But what they would do, they would teach the doctrine they wanted communicated to Canadians or Mexicans or New Zealanders or Australians, and then they would go and train the Americans. So that was the usual devious Soviet method of doing things. So my friend, he was in Moscow at the Institute. The New Zealand Communist delegation, 4 members, sat down with the KGB and the tutors of the Institute and worked out how they were going to break away New Zealand from the Western Alliance, because they wanted to break away at least one country in the hope of starting a chain reaction that led to the breakup of NATO and other Western alliances. And we were a small liberal country with a strong communist presence, and we were regarded as an easy target. So they worked out how they would sell it and how they would use psychology, and they worked out that they had a lot of knowledge about New Zealanders and their attitudes, and they thought they'd play the patriotic angle. So the New Zealand communists got this doctrine, they took it back to New Zealand, they used their secret members in the New Zealand Labour Party, they used the control of the Federation of Labour and the New Zealand Peace Movement. In a few short months, they had that passed as legislation in my country. It destroyed a long-standing military alliance, a 30-year alliance with a friendly country, destroyed in a few short months, and not one New Zealander in 100,000 will have any idea of the origins of that policy. Not one, and that's still the case today. So that is an example of how this process works. It's a series of cut-out steps, so that the Democrats, whoever push it, can put their hands on their heart and say, this is an indigenous local policy, nothing to do with communism. Now we'll go through a couple of examples in your country. A little symbolic one for a start. Out in California, every year they have a Cesar Chavez holiday. Okay? Cesar Chavez was trained by Saul Alinsky, a labour union agitator, founder of the United Farm Workers, worked extensively with communists and socialists his entire career. His slogan was, "Se se puede," yes we can. I know where he got it from, eh? So, the woman who got that passed was a woman called Evelina Alarcon from Southern California, leader of the Cesar Chavez holiday campaign. She used all her connections in the California state legislature. She enlisted a whole lot of left-wing movie stars, labour union activists, whatever, and they got that passed through the California state legislature. Evelina Alarcon is the leader of the Southern California Communist Party, USA. Now she's trying to do it nationwide, and on her website there's a big glowing endorsement of her campaign by Barack Obama. In 2008, Evelina Alarcon attended a function like this in Los Angeles where she gave a great big Cesar Chavez poster to Maya Santoro Ning, the sister of Barack Obama, and that was a great photo op for the campaign. So that is one small example of how this works. But there's a much bigger example, one that I'm sure you're all familiar with and all fearful of, and that is Obamacare. 1/6 of your economy stands to be socialised. It's not single-payer socialist healthcare yet, but we all know where it's heading. Now, the father of the socialised healthcare movement in this country is a guy called Quentin Young. He's a doctor, a medical doctor out of Chicago. He's pushing 90 now, but ever since after World War II, he's been agitating, setting up groups, forming alliances, working with congressmen like John Conyers and others to get single-payer legislation put on the floor of your Congress year after year after year. And in 2008, he hit the jackpot. And Barack Obama got legislation on your floor of Congress and across his desk. Now, Quentin Young was Barack Obama's personal physician in Chicago. He openly claims responsibility for indoctrinating Obama into the ideas of socialised medicine. He was also a 40-year veteran of the Communist Party USA until he left that organisation to found Democratic Socialists of America, another Marxist organisation. So please never tell me that one person can't change things, because that man, a communist, the ear of your president, stands on the brink of socialising 1/6 of your economy and all the implications that go with that. A lot of people say Barack Obama made a movement, a great movement. But I will say to you that a great movement made Barack Obama.
Yes.
Now that movement started in Hyde Park, Chicago, the South Chicago, leafy little enclave around the University of Chicago. Started here in the 1950s when the Communist Party USA and the Socialist Party USA got together to take on the daily machine, the big daily machine that ran Chicago for decades. So they joined up with the local black population, they agitated amongst the Latinos, got the labour unions on board. Does any of that sound familiar at all? Okay, they built a big alliance and they started to take over Chicago. You know, Chicago was run by crooks, but they wanted to have it run by communists. The first person they got elected was Leon Dupre. He was a Chicago City Councillor. Leon Dupre used to go to rifle ranges with Saul Alinsky in the 1920s, practicing shooting for when the revolution broke out. In the 1940s, he went down to Mexico to carry messages from American communists down to Trotsky, who was living in Mexico City at the time. So after Leon Dupre, the next guy that got elected was Harold Washington as mayor of Chicago in 1983. Now Washington was a hardcore leftist, long-time associate of the Communist Party USA and Democratic Socialists of America. And he filled his administration with leftists. So the next target, they got Carol Moseley Brown elected to the US Senate in 1992. And she later became an ambassador to my country, thanks to Mr. Clinton. And then they got Barack Obama elected to the Illinois State Senate. And in 2004, they got him to the US Senate. Then in 2008, by using their contacts and movement nationwide, they got their man into the White House. And he who pays the piper calls the tune. And they had their agenda all ready. And as soon as Mr. Obama was in the White House, he started it rolling. So, if we want to understand where Barack Obama comes from, we look at his mentors. Now the first real mentor of Obama was Frank Marshall Davis. Frank Marshall Davis was a Chicago communist in the 1940s, a black guy, a very prominent journalist, poet. He was a propagandist for the party, very well thought of, very up on the left in Chicago. But in 1948 he left all the glitter behind and moved out to Hawaii, which was a little bit of a backwater at the time. Now why would he do that? At the time, the Soviet Union had ordered the US Communist Party to get as many comrades out to Hawaii as possible to build up the strength of the party in the islands. And there were a couple of reasons for that. The first was that was where Pearl Harbor was, and they wanted as many spies on the island as they could. They wanted to keep tabs on Pearl Harbor. They also wanted agitators to close down Pearl Harbor if they possibly could. Another reason was the anticipation of a Hawaiian statehood, because they knew that if they could take over the local Democrat Party, they could guarantee 2 more hard left Democrats in your US Senate every term, and a whole bunch of left-wing congressmen as well. That is exactly why they backed the DC statehood movement for many years, and why today the communists are pushing for Puerto Rican statehood. Because they know that if they get that, they can move your country further to the left and marginalise you people even further. It's demographics, it's percentages, that's what they work on all the time. So in Hawaii, Frank Marshall Davis worked on the Honolulu Record, which was a labour union newspaper. His boss was Koji Ariyoshi, a Communist Party member who had worked in the United States Army in World War II with Mao Zedong's communist forces in China. After World War II, Ariyoshi went to New York, where he worked with the Amerasia people. These were a bunch of people who worked in the Amerasia magazine, and their job was to work with the US State Department to tilt US foreign policy away from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese towards Mao Zedong's communist Chinese. And they succeeded in that task, and they delivered 500 million Chinese to the communists, with huge implications for the world since. So in Hawaii, Frank Marshall Davis infiltrated the local Democrats, but he also had an interesting hobby. The FBI, who was watching him constantly, used to see him out photographing obscure beaches and hills and geographical features all around the country. Now there's a clear implication of why he was doing that, but the FBI was so concerned about Frank Marshall Davis, they put him on the security index. That meant had war ever broken out with the Soviet Union, he would have been arrested that day. Now not every communist was on that, only the particularly dangerous, high-ranking communists. A lot of people, so a few years later, Frank Marshall Davis, about 1970, is introduced to the young Barack Obama, and he mentors him for about 9 years, from the ages of 10 to the age of 19, until Obama left Occidental College in 1979. A lot of people will say, well, by that time Frank Marshall Davis was just a dope-smoking old alcoholic. His red days were well behind him, he was no threat. But as late as 1979, Frank Marshall Davis was listed as an endorser of the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born, the leading Communist Party USA front of the day. So there's no evidence at all that Frank Marshall Davis ever ceased being a hardcore Red. So Barack Obama left Hawaii. He went to Occidental College, where he mixed with the Democratic Socialists of American people there and Tom Hayden's radical crowd. Then he went to Columbia University in New York, and there he attended at least one and maybe two of the annual Socialist Scholars Conferences that were held in Cooper Union. They were organised by Democratic Socialists of America. They were 2,000 to 3,000 hardcore radical Marxists, labour unionists, radical feminists, black activists, all gathered in one room, one big hall, plotting to bring your country down. And Barack Obama was there in the thick of it. A few years later, Barack Obama decides to move to Chicago, and he was inspired by the election of the far-left Mayor Harold Washington. He even tried to get a job in the Washington administration. He didn't get that, but he came to Chicago as a community organiser, and after a few years he decided to get into politics. And he was introduced to Chicago politics, shown around the traps by a woman called Alice Palmer. Now, she was an Illinois state senator, and she wanted to run for Congress. And her idea was, I'll run for Congress, and Barack, you can take my state senate seat. So she showed him all around, and she was the woman who took Barack Obama to the famous meeting in the drawing room of Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn, the Weather Underground terrorist leaders of the 60s. Quentin Young was there as well. This was Barack Obama's introduction to the Hyde Park left, the left that had started this movement many years before. But Alice Palmer had a very interesting history. In 1980, she received a personal invitation to, and I've got the cards, copies of the card, to the first anniversary of the Marxist-Leninist revolution in Grenada in the Caribbean by Maurice Bishop himself, the leader of that island. Now, as Maurice Bishop's government was deposed by Reagan in 1983. Okay, so it was a communist government, and Alice Palmer was invited to attend their first anniversary celebrations. In 1983, Alice Palmer went to Czechoslovakia and Prague in communist Czechoslovakia for a meeting of the World Peace Council, a Soviet front. She was also an active leader of the US Peace Council, a Communist Party USA front, where she served with people like Barbara Lee out of California, for instance, now in your US Congress. In 1985, she took a delegation of black journalists to the Soviet Union, East Germany and Czechoslovakia, where they met with officials of the Czech Foreign Affairs Department and discussed issues to do with the United States of America. At that time, Palmer was head of the Black Press Institute, a nationwide network of black journalists, almost all communists, whose job was to agitate and sow disinformation amongst the black population of America. In 1986, Alice Palmer was the only American to cover that year's annual conference of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Moscow. The same year, she was elected head of the International Organization of Journalists, a bona fide Soviet front aimed at working amongst the journalists of the world. Her responsibility was to look after, to monitor activities in the US, Canada, Mexico and the Caribbean. And part of her job was to implement what they called their new information order, which was to do with issues of what they called media fairness. Now, who here remembers the fairness doctrine many years ago? Okay, now the fairness doctrine was abolished by Ronald Reagan. What it was if you had a radio station and you put a conservative on for 2 hours, you had to give equal time to a liberal. Okay? It was social justice on the airways, because the liberals didn't think it was fair that conservatives could say what they said and get sponsorship and money while nobody listened to the liberals. Okay, so the fairness doctrine was there to give them equal time. It was only when Reagan abolished that conservative talkback became economic, and we had the Rush Limbaughs and the Sean Hannitys and all these people started a movement that basically led to what you've got today. So I just ask you to consider where that fairness doctrine may have come from. Okay, so that was Alice Palmer. She was, to put it bluntly, a high-level Soviet operative with connections to the highest levels of the communist governments of the Eastern Bloc. And she got your president his first job in politics. Is there a pattern starting to form here? Okay, now we look to modern times. You're judged by the company you keep. And there's two people that are very close to Obama that I'd like to talk about. The first is the other half of Barack Obama's brain, Valerie Jarrett. Okay, now she introduced Obama to his wife, she's fundraised for him, close family friends, and she is his closest advisor in the White House. There's no question they are like that. Now Valerie Jarrett had a very interesting pedigree. Her mother is Barbara Bowman out of Chicago. Now Barbara Bowman runs the Erickson Institute, a child psychology institute that has a lot of influence on early childhood education in this country. In 2009, President Obama gave Barbara Bowman an award for her work, and that was very prominently covered in the Communist Party USA's People's World. The Erickson Institute is named after Erik Erikson, an errant disciple of Sigmund Freud. He's the man who coined the term identity crisis, which some of you may have heard. Okay, in the 1940s, Erik Erikson was expelled or kicked out of Berkeley, that's Berkeley, because he refused to sign an anti-communist loyalty oath. He was also a lecturer at the time at the California Labor School, the Communist Party's Labor School at the time in that area. On the board of the Erickson Institute have served Tom Ayers, the father of Weather Underground terrorist Bill Ayers, and Bernadine Dawn, the wife of Bill Ayers and a prominent terrorist in her own right. On the other side of Valerie Jarrett's family, you have her late father-in-law, Vernon Jarrett. Now, Vernon Jarrett was a very prominent black Chicago journalist, and the last thing he did on his deathbed, as he was dying of cancer in 2004, he issued a call through his columns to the black population of Chicago to get out and vote for Barack Obama in that year's primaries, that year's Senate primaries. It followed Obama's career for many years. In 1946, Vernon Jarrett served on the Illinois State Executive of American Youth for Democracy. Lovely sounding organisation. But it wasn't the youth wing of the Democrat Party, it was the youth wing of the Communist Party USA. In 1948, Vernon Jarrett served on the publicity committee of the Packing House Workers Strike Committee, a Communist Party USA front. On that publicity committee with Vernon Jarrett served Frank Marshall Davis. So isn't it interesting that there are two people sitting in the White House today who can trace their political lineage back right directly to the Communist Party USA in Chicago of the 1940s. Now we'll look at the other half of Barack Obama's brain, which doesn't leave a lot, and that is David Axelrod. You know, the man who got Obama elected, the man who is running his campaign out of Chicago as we speak. David Axelrod, his mother was Merrill Bennett. Merrill Bennett is a woman who came up with the idea of focus groups. You know, when you go to a gathering and you discuss a new toothpaste or a new political slogan or whatever, and you make comments and you get a free movie ticket or whatever you get. But that was her idea. But before that, she worked on a magazine in New York called PM. Supposedly a liberal magazine, but nearly half of its staff members were known Communist Party USA members, including at least one Soviet spy, the famous journalist Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone. When David Axelrod moved to Chicago in about 1975 to study political science, he was picked up and mentored and trained and guided in his early career by two prominent Chicago journalists, Don Rose and David S. Cantor. Now, Rose and Cantor had a little publication based in Hyde Park called the Hyde Park Kenwood Voices. It was basically the publication of the Hyde Park left. And it featured articles about Quentin Young's trip to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, his son Ethan's trip to Cuba to cut sugarcane for Castro, covered the SDS riots in Chicago in 1968, and it covered and promoted the career of Congressman Abner Mikva, a far-left Democrat, an Alinsky associate out of Chicago. Abner Mikva in the later years became an open supporter of Democratic Socialists of America, and he was in his time a very prominent mentor to Barack Obama and also to Yelena Kagan, who now sits on your Supreme Court.
Any other questions?
The other half of the Rose Cantor Partnership, David S. Cantor, his father was Harry Cantor, the leader in the 1930s of the Massachusetts Communist Party. He was jailed for a year for sedition over the Sacco-Vanzetti case when 2 Italian anarchists were jailed for murder, executed for murder. After getting out of jail, Harry Cantor took his whole family, including baby David, to the Soviet Union, where they lived in Stalin's paradise for many years. But by the 1940s, David Cantor was living in Chicago. He was the editor of the student newspaper at Chicago University, and he was a prominent activist in the Communist Party USA. You go forward a few years, 1960, and David Cantor and his partner, Communist Party member Leroy Wolins, ran a little organisation in Chicago called Trans World Publications. The Trans World Publications, their job was to distribute Soviet and communist literature throughout the United States, and they were paid a regular subsidy by the Soviet embassy in Washington to do so. They were actually required to register as agents of a foreign power. Now you go forward a few more years, 1964. Who remembers Barry Goldwater? Great conservative, a real patriot, and had he won the 1964 presidential election, you wouldn't have had Lyndon Johnson, and you wouldn't have had the Great Society, the great advance in socialism, and this country would be a whole different place than it is today. But one of the main reasons that Barry Goldwater did not win that year, that he was extensively vilified as a racist, a fascist, and an extremist. Now, do any of those terms sound familiar to any of you people?
Yes, it does.
You know, the more things change.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the main sources of the anti-Goldwater propaganda, the anti-Goldwater smears, was Trans World Publications out of Chicago. So I'm saying to you that your man Axelrod, who's trying to get your president re-elected, was trained and mentored by a Soviet-paid black propagandist. So where did he learn his tricks from? Where did he learn his smear techniques from? So that is what you're up against in David Axelrod. Now that brings me to what I believe is the real agenda of the left in this country. You know, what do they want? You know, what are they working day and night to achieve? Do they want to make you like France? Some people say. France is pretty cool. You know, I wouldn't mind living there.
They want to destroy our Constitution.
Well, that's part of it, and I'll say even more. Before I say what I think they want to do, I want to build up a little bit of credibility for an Albuquerque high school math teacher named Mark Rudd. Now, why would I want to do that? Mark Rudd was the brains of the Weather Underground, the terrorist organisation. He was right up there in the leadership with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. He was one of their top people. He was the leader of the Columbia University SDS riots in 1968, and in 1969 he trained in Cuba under a KGB major. In 2006, Mark Rudd and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn and Jeff Jones, another terrorist Weather Underground leader, who incidentally helped write Obama's stimulus package, they got together with a whole bunch of Communist Party USA members and Democratic Socialist America members and former SDSs and and Black Panther radicals, and they set up Movement for a Democratic Society, another one of those lovely sounding organisations. MDS was an adult support group for the new SDS, which is now active on campuses all over America. They were the people that created Mary Hell at the Republican Party convention in Minneapolis a few years ago. So they set that up with Tom Hayden, Angela Davis, a whole lot of people you might recognise. But in 2008, they set up, Tom Hayden and some of the others set up a subsidiary organisation which was called Progressives for Obama. And that was designed to unite progressive support for the new candidate. And Mark Rudd endorsed that organisation. So what I'm trying to say here is that Mark Rudd knows the left. He's intimately involved in it, and he knows people who know your president personally. So when he says something about Obama's agenda, I will listen to him and give him some credence. So in 2008, November, just after the election, Barack Obama appointed some conservatives to positions in the defence establishment. And some people on our side of the fence went, thank God for that. You know, maybe he's not such a crazy radical after all. He's putting these conservatives into defence. Maybe he's going to play to the centre. But the left was spewing. They have got this guy elected, and what is he doing? Putting conservatives into the hated military-industrial complex. So Mark Rudd was getting all sorts of emails about this, and he had to calm the comrades down. So he wrote a little article in a rag blog out of Texas, Austin, Texas. It's a blog run by former SDS's, former Weather Underground people. And he wanted to settle the folks down. And this is what he wrote. It was on November 28th, just a few days after the election. It was entitled, Let's Get Smart About Obama. And this is what he said. Obama is a very strategic thinker. He knew precisely what it would take to get elected, and he didn't blow it. He knew he had to play to the centre, to not be run over by the press, the Republicans, or scare centrist voters. He made it. So he has a narrow mandate for change. The economic agenda will stress stimulation from the bottom sometimes and handouts to the top at others. How would an Albuquerque math teacher know that? On foreign policy and the wars and the use of the military, there will be no change at all. And never threaten the military budget. That will unite a huge majority of Congress against him. And I agree with this strategy. Anything else would invite sure defeat. Leave the military alone because they're way too powerful for now. By the second or third year of this recession, when stimulus is needed at the bottom, people may begin to discuss cutting the military budget. Now, where are we now, ladies and gentlemen? We're 3 years in. You're all worried about your jobs, your mortgages, keeping your kids in college, paying your taxes, keeping yourselves afloat. And what is Leon Panetta doing over at the Pentagon right now? 6% of US federal spending is taking all 100% of the hits. Nothing else is being touched. Barack Obama is even talking about cutting US nuclear arsenal by 80%. At a time when Russia and China and Iran and Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua and North Korea are all working together and resurging to form a power bloc against you, when Europe is on the verge of flames, when economic chaos looms on the horizon, when we're entering the most unstable period since World War II, Barack Obama and Leon Panetta want to slash your defences. And who do you think might benefit from that? So Mark Rudd goes on to say, Obama plays basketball. I'm not much of an athlete, I barely know the game. But one thing I do know is that you have to be able to look like you're doing one thing, but do another. That's why all these Conservative appointments are important. The strategy is to feint right, move left. Any other strategy invites sure defeat. So what does that tell you, ladies and gentlemen? To Mark Rudd, that means his man scammed his way into the presidency by pretending to be a centrist, but his agenda is left. And he has got your military establishment firmly in his sights. That is where he wants to go. And what will happen then? If you cut your defences far enough, you'll come to the point where you can not only defend, you will not only be not able to defend your own homeland, well, let alone you will not be able to defend Israel or New Zealand or Australia. You will not even be able to defend your own homeland, and you will have no choice but to accept some sort of United Nations world government or face the military might of the combined forces of your enemies, because they hate you. You are the only thing standing between them and world domination. And they have been agitating for 50 or 60 years to do exactly what Barack Obama and Leon Panetta are doing right today. And that is why I care about what happens here. Because if you go down, my country will follow. And believe me, they want to take you down. So this is not about France. This is about making your country like Cuba. Okay? Now that brings me to Leon Panetta. Voted 100-0 into his position by your Senate. A very nice man, very affable. But what is it? He's got 2 years military experience. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who've got a lot more than that. But he's a budget cutter. That's what he did in the White House. He's a budget expert. His job is to cut your military budget with the minimum amount of squawking from the Republicans and the United States public. That's what he's there for. But Leon Panetta, go back a little bit in history. Leon Panetta was a left-wing Democrat congressman out of Santa Cruz, Southern California. But that is not the Oklahoma Democrat Party, or the Kansas Democrat Party, or the Nebraska Democrat Party. That is a far-left, lunatic fringe Southern California Democrat Party. Leon Panetta had Democratic Socialists of America members on his campaign committees and worked extensively with DSA members like Mike Laird and others all through the time he was a congressman. He put tributes in the congressional record to communist Lucy Hasler. He defended and campaigned for the release from jail for Leonard Peltier, an American Indian activist from North Dakota, jailed for the murder of 2 FBI agents. And Leon Panetta tried to get him out of the slammer. But Leon Panetta also had a friend. The Panettas did. Sylvia and Leon were very close to Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy, 2 Santa Cruz activists. They had parties at each other's houses and exchanged greetings. They were very pally. For 9 years, Hugh DeLacy and Leon Panetta exchanged correspondence, which I have, where they talked about how horrible Reagan's Star Wars plans were, how they needed to cut the US defense budget, how they needed to oppose Reagan's plans in Latin America to oppose the communists, all a far-left agenda. Leon Panetta even copied a Brookings Institution defence paper which was not available for public consumption. He borrowed it for 2 weeks and copied it and gave a copy to Hugh DeLacy. Now, at the time, Hugh DeLacy was visiting Nicaragua and the Sandinista government. He was also going to Spain for visits with the Spanish Communist Party. If you go back further, it gets even worse. Hugh DeLacy, in 1946, from 1946 to 1948, was a Democrat member of your Congress from Washington State. He spent his entire time on the floor of Congress agitating for US foreign policy to shift away from supporting Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists in China and to supporting Mao Zedong's communists. And that's not surprising, because Hugh de Lacy was, while he was a member of Congress, a secret member of the Communist Party USA. And that's not me saying that, that's a generally acknowledged historical fact. He maintained that party membership at least to the late 60s and possibly into the early 70s, when he then became involved with Democratic Socialists of America and the other radical crowd. But it was an interesting, you know, no good deed, no bad deed goes unrewarded in this corrupt world, and as a reward for that work in Congress, in 1975, Hugh de Lacy and his wife Dorothy were given an all-expenses-paid trip to Communist China at the, on the dime of the Chinese Communist Party. The trip was arranged by a Stanford University academic called John Stuart Service, who had been a member of the Amerasia spy ring of the 1940s. So here's Mr. de Lacy in China, visiting the collective farms and the factories and watching the little kids wave the red flags and all that kind of thing. But when he wasn't doing that, he had time to visit with two American expatriates. Now, one of them was Frank Coe. Frank Coe was at the time working as a propagandist for the Chinese Communist government. But in the 1940s, he'd been a Communist Party USA member and an Amerasia aspiring member, and also involved with the Silver Master KGB spy ring in Washington. The other guy he visited was Solomon Adler, who was also a former member of the Amerasia and Silver Master spy rings, and at the time was a serving advisor to the Chinese intelligence services. He was a live Chinese spy. So, back in the United States, Hugh de Lacy was also corresponding regularly with Don Wheeler, a Communist Party member out of Washington State and another former member of the Silver Master spy ring. He is also corresponding with Victor Perlow from Connecticut, another former member, communist, and another former member of the Silver Master spy ring. He was also serving as a US agent for the West Coast agent for In These Times, which was a socialist journal based out of Chicago. That was run by James Weinstein, a former Communist Party member, a founder of Democratic Socialists of America, and peripherally involved in the Rosenberg spy ring of the 1940s, the people who gave the atom bomb to Stalin. In 2002, James Weinstein and a bunch of communists like Marilyn Katz and Carl Davidson set up a big peace rally, an anti-Iraq war rally in Federal Plaza in Chicago. And that was where Barack Obama first made his name nationwide as an opponent of the Iraq war. That's when he first got onto the national stage. So I repeat my claim. Barack Obama did not make a movement. A movement made Barack Obama. A movement that has connections and links to people whose loyalties do not belong to this country. So, I don't want you people to get too depressed by all that. Okay?
That's good.
Because there is some positive news. In 2008, the left thought they had a slam dunk. They had the Congress, the Senate, and the White House. They had their agenda set to roll, and they were going to steamroll you people into oblivion. The socialist agenda was just going to roll on. And in 2009 and 2010, you people and hundreds of thousands like you got up and stood on your Constitution, and you kicked the left so far up the backside, they're still seeing stars today. You stopped cap and trade. You stopped card check. You delayed Obamacare and got it watered down. You took back the Congress, got a whole lot more conservatives in there, and you stalled the Obama agenda, and the left hates you for it.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to handle you. They think you've all gone away, but you know, right now you're in there, you're in the state houses, you're in the school boards, you're in the local districts, you're fighting Agenda 21, you're taking this country back from the grassroots up. And the left are out there making fools of themselves with the Occupy movements and all that kind of thing, alienating middle America, while you guys are enacting 1773 of the Second American Revolution. You know, this is the new revolution, and you guys are in the forefront of that.
Now we gotta buy it for it.
You got it. But there's more. A lot of people, you know, I talk to Tea Party movements all around the country. I've been to Arizona, Alabama, you know, Arkansas, you know, Florida, New Jersey, Arizona, California, Oregon, and everywhere I go, people tell me, look, there's not enough of us, people won't listen, this is really hard work. But I come in as an outsider, and I got to say, I'm blown away. I'm so impressed about what you guys have achieved in a short time. Virtually all of you are novices, but you're standing up, you're talking about your Constitution, you're talking about American exceptionalism, you're rediscovering your roots, and you're fighting at the grassroots to take your country back. And as somebody from the outside, that is so, so impressive. And there are people all over this world watching you, freedom lovers everywhere, watching what you guys do and rooting for you, because we know that when you can succeed, we can emulate you and restore freedom in our countries.
Yes.
So please do not underestimate the power of your movement. This is the beginning. As I say, it's 1773. This is the first stirring. There is no way in 1773, if you look at it back then, most of the people were Tories or apathetic, but a few people guided by a vision, a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers and printers and lawyers formed an army and took on the greatest empire the world had known up to that point and beat them. Now, if that wasn't miraculous, I can't think of anything that was. You know, that was an amazing event. It never should have happened, but it did. And this is the Second American Revolution. And I say to you, in 200 years' time, there'll be kids sitting around in school libraries, and they'll be saying things like, did you know that my great-great-great-grandma and granddad, they were in the Tea Party? Do you know, they stood up and they took this country back in its hour of peril. And we are free today because of what they did then. So please keep it in historical perspective. What you're doing is so vital and so important, and it's not just the fate of your country that's at stake, it's my country and my children's future that's at stake as well. So I want you to succeed, and I know that if you keep the faith and keep rolling on, you will do that. You'll take this country back, because there's a lot more of you than there are of them, and the people of this country generally share your values. So I just want to say that I'm so grateful for what you guys are doing. I'm so proud to be associated with you, and I want to say thank you very, very much, and God bless America. Happy to take questions. Yes, ma'am.
Where does George Soros fit
It
in?
comes up every single time. Every time. And it's very important. It is. Look, I'll just give a little bit of my theories about George Soros. George Soros was a young Jewish kid in Hungary during World War II. And his parents, his father, got him fostered by a non-Jewish family to keep him safe, which was, which is good. But his foster father was a capo. He used to go around confiscating Jewish property for the Nazis. And young George used to go around with him. So it was a very happy time of his life. So when the Soviets took over Hungary after World War II, they basically executed and imprisoned Nazi collaborators. They didn't like them. But George Soros, who was effectively a Nazi collaborator, was allowed to pass out through a whole lot of Soviet checkpoints, through occupied Hungary, through Soviet-occupied Austria, to make his way up to the west, where he got to England and got himself set up in the London School of Economics and set up in business. Now, I think it would be very hard to do that had you not made some sort of deal with the authorities. Now, everything George Soros has done since then, funding the Democrats, funding the far left in this country, he has worked with the Chinese and the Russians extensively. Everything he's done has been in the interests of the East and against the interests of the West. So I think George Soros' loyalties do not lie with this country. And when America starts to get serious about internal security again, which you have to do, when you have Senate committees and House committees investigating subversives and radicals, George Soros should be one of the first people to be subpoenaed. He should be put on the stand under oath and interrogated and questioned until the truth of his loyalties are determined. And I think that can't happen soon enough. Oh, yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you so much for what you've done. And with what you've done, I have 3 questions, if permissible. You know all this, and yet we have a very good, let's call it a right-wing media. Why are they not reporting this? Why doesn't Charles Krauthammer or Bill O'Reilly even? I mean, why won't they come out with this information?
Beck does.
Beck does.
Yeah,
But
Glenn
Beck
Beck
was
has.
taken off.
Andrew Breitbart is, the late Andrew
Right.
Breitbart, God rest his soul. He has used a lot of it. Some of it's been a national review.
But I'm talking about the more mainstream, because many
Because
people
they are
don't-
mainstream.
But even Charles Krauthammer?
Well, I don't know about Krauthammer, I can't speak for him, but Bill O'Reilly I wouldn't regard as
No, I
particularly, Look, it's Cliff Kincaid and I released a lot of this information in 2008, and even a lot of conservatives wouldn't touch it. They didn't want to appear McCarthyite or old-fashioned or whatever. It was only really when Van Jones, which was basically my information, was sacked from the White House that people actually thought, wow, this guy does actually employ communists. And so the acceptance of what I'm saying has grown a lot, but it needs to grow a lot more, because really Americans have to face the fact that you have enemies who want to take your country down. They're uniting against you, and a large chunk of them are in your government. Both sides, yeah.
Or so-called fellow Americans. That's-
Fellow Americans.
Most people don't want to accept that the guy sitting next to them actually hates them enough that they want to enslave them.
Well, look, that's right. Americans, you've lived in the greatest and freest and most prosperous country the world has ever known. And that makes you generous and open-hearted and kind and honourable. And you find it very hard to comprehend that a lot of the rest of the world doesn't think like that, and that a few of your countrymen don't think like that either. And while you're all, enjoying the Reagan years and the Bush years and looking after your families and building your businesses and your careers, the 60s generation, the Belliers and the Bernardine Dawns, the ones who failed in the revolution at that time, were burrowing into the Democrat Party, taking over the labour unions, burrowing into the universities, the news media, and when they got their man into the White House in 2008, they were rolling. And you saw how quick it happened.
I
So,
have 2 more questions if I may. Puerto Rico, you said, would not be a good idea to become a state, but would they have a very conservative governor now? Does that change things a little bit? Or?
well, yeah, but look, I've got nothing against Puerto Ricans. I'm just saying that they know that Puerto Rico tends to vote Democrat. And you are more, and they know they'll get the odd conservative in every now and then, just as they get the odd conservative out of Hawaii. But they know the trend will be to the left. The trend will be to the Democrats. So it's just another way of pushing your country, make it a little bit harder for the Republicans to get a majority, make it a little bit easier for Democrats to get a majority. Because the left controls the Democrats now. You know, Ann Coulter had it right. She said there are a lot of bad Republicans, but there are no good Democrats. Okay? And I'm not saying at the local level, but the leadership of if you want to know what the Democrat Party is going to do tomorrow, you read the Communist Party USA's People's World Today or Democratic Socialists of America's Democratic Left Today, because they are setting the agenda for the Democrat Party. Because they control the unions, and the Democrats depend on the unions to get elected, so they will follow the communist or socialist line to keep their jobs.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am?
Yes, what I've often wondered about is, and he connected a lot of dots, do you know what was the major factor that caused him to go to Chicago? He went to university here, well, sorry, I'm a transport from that great state of Brooklyn that some people think is part of New York City. And I think of us being connected to New York, if he was in New York.
Yeah.
And yet he didn't get established in the political scene in New York, which is every bit as corrupt as Chicago ever was and is. What made him go to Chicago?
Because, in my opinion, he says he went because he was inspired by Harold Washington, who was...
But you didn't meet him, did he, until
No.
he went out there?
No, but Harold Washington was known on the left at the time that Chicago had elected a left-wing Democrat and the administration was filling... It was basically a model for what's happening today on a local level. But look, I believe he was primed to go there. He was going to the networks that Frank Marshall Davis had prepared for him. You know, Frank Marshall Davis mentored him, he was connected to the Chicago left, and Barack Obama was chosen from a very early age for great things. And he was going where his people were waiting for him. And that's how I believe it happened. He planned to go there because he knew the movement was there waiting for him.
A second question you triggered in my mind. Did you say it was you, DeLacy, that was in the state of Washington? Did you say in the 60s?
No, 40s, 1940s. In 1940s Washington, the communists ran the Democrat Party in Washington state. They used to call it the Soviet of Washington. It was 49 states in the Soviet of Washington.
Oh, what my dots have happened to be is that much has been said and written that Barack's maternal grandparents were communists.
Yeah.
Therefore, and by implication they did say the mother. And he says he gets his values from her. And I've just recently become aware that as soon as he was born, she went to school in Washington and supposedly had been with her, although I wonder if he was really with her at that point or in Hawaii.
Well, that's right. And they had lived out on Mercer Island, which was a left-wing enclave at the time. Then they went to Hawaii. Then after having Barack Obama, she went back. So Washington, and today remains a bastion of the left. But it was certainly in the 40s and the 60s, it was still a pretty liberal environment, and she was right in the middle of the most liberal left-wing part of it.
And this just making me think tonight that when he said most recently that he got his values from his mother, that's what he meant, because I wanted to ask him, what values did you get?
Yeah, look, she met Barack Obama Sr. in a Russian language class. Now,
Right.
who studies Russian language in 1960? You know?
Thank you.
It's not a question, but what you're, like they were saying, you're connecting the dots. I guess for me, Senator McCarthy, who was demonized, obviously had it right. The problem was that too many, again, Americans would not allow us to believe that there were fellow Americans even back then. You're talking about the 1940s.
Yeah.
In the state. He obviously understood this, and yet, you know, again, like we were saying about Barry Goldwater, well, maybe if we had allowed him to really do what needed to be done, if he were to be in this position, allow him to infiltrate our government.
Exactly. Well, he was demonized.
He was.
Exactly as you people are demonized, like Reagan was demonized, like the Tea Party, the Goldwater was demonized. You know, like I had an Australian friend. He was a communist, and I'm going to use a crudity here in a minute. But he was an Australian Communist Party member. His father was a Communist Party member, but he was kicked out of the party and became a conservative. And I asked him about McCarthyism, and he said, "Look, I was in the party right through the main part of McCarthyism, and they said we were shit scared of him." Okay. But the thing was, and only Aussies would say that, Kiwis don't talk like that. but he would say he didn't go anywhere near far enough. The State Department was never cleaned out. The universities were never cleaned out. He did a good job, but not enough. And now you don't have one Communist Party in the United States, you have dozens of them. And the Democrat Party is basically what the Communist Party used to be back in those times. Their policies are identical. So that's what they do, they demonise their opposition. The phrase McCarthyism was coined by the Daily World, the Communist Party's paper. And they get all their friendly journalists and whatever to blacken someone's name. Just as it did with Sarah Palin, you know, back in modern times.
That we need to be a little bit smarter than them at this point. We cannot allow them to frame the argument anymore. We cannot allow them to tell us who we need to, you know, leave behind. We have good people, and we need to stand up and stop being silent about it, and like an Andrew Breitbart, get into their faces and not let them think we're fearful of them. No, they have to fear us.
Yeah, sticks and stones, you know. Don't buy into their crap. Simple.